All right, we should get started here. There are still a number of people logging in, but to be mindful of everyone's time, I think it makes sense to get started. For those of you that don't know, my name is Ryan Tolson. I lead the commercial team when it comes to Esgian offshore wind. I see many names that are logging on here that I recognize. I see many names that are new, but I want to thank you all for attending today. For those of you that do not know who Esgian is, we are a market intelligence and data analysis company headquartered in Oslo, Norway. We specialize in the ocean industries. We operate in three primary segments. That's offshore rigs, shipping, and offshore wind. My focus being 100% offshore wind, and the focus today is offshore wind. Each month we host a short and timely webinar that covers a very current and relevant offshore wind topic. We do our very best effort to keep these to 19 minutes. We do understand everyone's time is precious, and we want to provide you with quality information in the shortest period of time. But if you haven't already, I do encourage you to follow Esgian Offshore Wind on LinkedIn and sign up for our newsletter. This is where you'll be kept up to date on all of our future events, including our monthly webinar series, news, and our quarterly reports. Within Esgian Offshore Wind, we offer a subscription-based data platform that provides transparency and clarity into the global offshore wind market. Our clients are developers, companies within the supply chain, consultancies, financial organizations, government agencies, and much, much more. We are helping our clients primarily with business development, competitive and strategic analysis, and a general understanding of the overall market. But for today's discussion, we're very, very excited to highlight the offshore wind awards and opportunities. We'll touch on key highlights from the recent allocation rounds, including upcoming awards, the most attractive markets, and who is bidding and who is sitting out. We'll touch on developments in the key markets with new project areas, lease rounds, and opportunities being proposed, focusing on the growing pipeline of projects towards 2030 and beyond. I do want to emphasize that all of the information that we cover today is derived from our wind analytics database. And on today's call, we have two of my colleagues, Oliver and Casper. And with that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Oliver, who leads the offshore wind team. And with that being said, Oliver, you can take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Ryan. Time is short, so we've got a lot to cram in, so I'll kick things off and get down to it as quickly as we can here. So given the feedback from our clients after last month's most recent quarterly update, we decided to dedicate today's webinar to give you guys an update on lease rounds. There's been a huge amount of activity so far this year. We can see a lot lined up for the rest of 2024. So the intention today is to distill some of this by giving our thoughts on events, whether that's both recent historic events and then upcoming events. And to do this, we're going to select a couple of countries to focus on in each of the three regions that we cover. I'll pick up two of those regions and Casper will pick up one and bring things to a conclusion. We don't intend to provide a fully comprehensive view of all the countries. There's just far too much going on around the world to even try to attempt that. But I would say if we don't cover the country of your particular interest, then if you're a client, please do give us a call to discuss. We're happy to jump on those calls and give our opinions. And as always, you can find all of the data that we use on our wind analytics platform, as Ryan mentioned. So having said that, let's get on with it. As with other sections of the offshore wind market, Q1 was exceptionally slow, as we discussed in our last quarterly update. Our expectation around the timing of lease awards was that momentum would pick up in Q2, and you can see that has clearly been the case. The chart here is showing the increase in volumes that have been awarded around the world and that we expect to be awarded as well. Our clear expectation is that we're going to have a busy 7 months left for the rest of 2024. Having said that, we do expect some of the volumes that we're currently showing on this slide, on this chart, for the fourth quarter of this year to slip into 2025. But I don't think that should diminish from it being a very, very busy year. In total, we're looking at the possibility that more than 86 gigawatts of capacity is potentially going to be awarded to developers in this 12-month period. The focus this second quarter of the year has been on Australia, which saw the enormous award of 25 gigawatts of capacity. And while Australia was certainly responsible for the majority of the lease awards that you can see on this chart in Q2, that's definitely not the only story, and there's ongoing activity around the world. So let's get into some of these different countries, and we'll start the runoff around the 6 countries we're going to look at today by looking at Australia. And as I mentioned, it took the headlines earlier in May this year with the award of 6 locations and then the provisional award subject to further clarifications of an additional 6 areas. And as mentioned, this came to a total of 25 gigawatts, which, to be honest, was a little bit higher than we'd been expecting. And we had also been expecting 10 awards, not 12. If we look at who's been successful in the Gippsland process, it was the larger established developers that proved to be the most successful, bolstering their global portfolios substantially. And companies here include Ørsted, Corio Generation, Ocean Winds, Iberdrola, RWE, CIP, that the big guys were the big winners. Notable here as well are other Australian participants that have made their first steps into the offshore wind sector, more domestic companies such as Beach Energy and Origin Energy. Now, clearly, there's going to be questions about the supply chain's ability to adapt in order to deliver on this build out. But purely looking at this in terms of a leasing process, the feedback has largely been very positive and the volumes undoubtedly substantial. The next step we watch here is how the CFD process progresses. But importantly for us, it doesn't stop there. We're looking for results from the Hunter Coast lease round towards the end of this year. And there we're looking for potentially another 5 gigawatts, maybe more, of capacity to be awarded. And then our attention turns to subsequent rounds that we're tracking in South Australia, in West Australia with Perth Bunbury, and then also in Tasmania with the Bass Strait. All of these are expected to be significant with multi-gigawatt sizes on offer. Plenty of volumes in Australia. If we turn to Japan, that's quite a different story here. The lease rounds that we're seeing in Japan have shown what we feel is steady progress, and particularly after the surprise award, surprise in inverted commas, of all 3 blocks to consortia that included Mitsubishi back in 2021, very late 2021. Since then, we've had a number of processes conclude successfully. Most recently, in Q1, we had Happo Nishiro, which saw Iberdrola joining up with local domestic companies, JRE and Tohoku Electric, as the winner. If we look at these processes, the volumes of the individual blocks that are being won and are on offer are still a lot smaller than we see in processes in other countries. Here we're looking at about 300 to 400 megawatts in size, sometimes up to 700 megawatts, but certainly smaller than we see in other jurisdictions. Despite this relatively small volumes being on offer, the lease processes are still generating reasonable interest from potential developers and being relatively competitive. It's apparent and probably no surprise that the majority of participants are domestic Japanese companies, whether that's predominantly the utilities, but also seeing some construction companies taking part. But notably for us, we're seeing international developers finding some success, both the Iberdrola victory that I mentioned earlier, but also RWE taking part in winning bids. If we look a bit further to the future, the pipeline of future leasing processes now appears to us to be pretty well defined in Japan. Areas are clearly progressing through that funnel of opportunities with the total aggregate volume that's being made available expected to be rather substantial, even if the individual allocations are not so big. And this for us adds to the growing confidence that we see in the market, really displaying that strong future visibility. The majority of these areas that we've got that clarity on are in relatively shallow water. But beyond that, we're already tracking a lease round that's dedicated to floating wind, which is taking part in 4 distinct areas, 4 different regions. And there are legislative moves to extend areas into the wider exclusive economic zone, which for the longer term perspective means that there'll be considerably deeper water available than is currently up for grabs at the moment. Changing tack and moving to the Americas, it's been undoubtedly a busy time in the US, and this is both short-term and also giving us longer-term clarity on future lease rounds. We tackle the shorter term first. We think the Central Atlantic is likely to come up first later this year. We've got much more sense of what will happen both there. And then also most recently, when we're looking at Maine on the Atlantic coast and also Oregon on the Pacific West coast, both of which will be pretty deep water floating areas. Maine, we now know, will have 8 individual blocks available. Among those pre-qualified companies that may potentially bid but have no requirement to bid. But those that are pre-qualified include Iberdrola, Corio, Ocean Winds, Total Energies, amongst others. Here in Maine, on the East Coast, we're expecting 15 gigawatts, although obviously that may be bigger or smaller, depending on the outcome of the process. But that 15 gigawatts compares to just over 3 gigawatts that we're seeing in Oregon, where we've got 2 available blocks, Coos Bay and Brookings. And for those blocks in Oregon, we expect interest from the pre-qualified companies plus others. The pre-qualified companies there are Ocean Winds, Iberdrola, Mainstream Renewable Power, and Blue Float. Moving into next year, although potentially creeping into this year, we wait and see on that one. The timing looks a little bit fluid now with what we're hearing from BOEM. But at the moment in our database, it's sitting in next year. But here we're looking at the second Gulf of Mexico lease round. Hopefully that will be somewhat more successful than the previous Gulf of Mexico round that only saw RWE bidding. Beyond this, in May of this year, earlier this month, BOEM did provide a comprehensive roadmap of lease rounds through to at least 2028, 2029. I say comprehensive. It doesn't give exact dates, doesn't give exact locations, and definitely doesn't give exact volumes on offer. But it's the first sign that gives a wider perspective of what we should be expecting, when that's going to take place and where. We expect the details to be filled in the next couple of years, but it does significantly add to the confidence that we have in the longer term dynamics of the US market. Staying in the Americas, if we turn to Brazil now, the reason we chose Brazil is because it's a very dramatically different situation that we're seeing. And this is entirely due to it being at a very different stage of development for offshore wind compared to the other countries that we're going to cover today. There's a lot more uncertainty given this early stage, but we see some positive signs of progress. The emphasis very much on the long-term potential of the country. But in the short term, what are we watching? Well, we're closely looking at the outcome of the legislative processes that are now well underway, primarily to see what it means for lease round. And the big questions for us are around the structure of those lease rounds. Will it veer more closely to the open door processes that we continue to see in some other jurisdictions? Or will it be more directed towards specific, very well-defined areas for companies to bid in? And then the subsequent question is, what does that mean for all of the overlapping areas that we have seen being announced so far? It's without doubt been something of a land grab, Wild West approach in the last 3 or 4 years in terms of new project announcements. And somewhat inevitably, this has resulted in areas where there is a high degree of competition. So for us, the interesting questions are going to be which geographic zones will be prioritised, and then also how will conflicts be managed, presumably through some sort of competitive process. So a lot of uncertainty in Brazil, but one thing we can be sure of with regard to Brazil is that future lease rounds will have very high volumes of capacity up for grabs, with plenty of opportunities for developers. So moving on to Europe, let me hand things over to Casper to take you through the next two countries.
Thank you, Oliver. We move over to some key updates from the European markets. First to France, where we have lately seen an increase in the ambitions for offshore wind. Compared to neighboring UK and Germany, France has fewer projects in the pipeline and are used to a somewhat long leasing round process. This seems to now be changing, with France now aiming to pick up the pace. France currently has right under 1 gigawatt operational capacity, with an additional 9.5 in the pipeline. Results of the AO5 round was also announced last week, awarding an up to 270 megawatts floating project. And the results of the AO6 round is expected by the end of the year. So some new projects are seeing progress. To speed up activity further, French authorities have proposed awarding a new 12.5 gigawatts in the coming years, with the first batch of leasing rounds to possibly start next year. At the start of May, the French also published details on the new AO9 and AO10 rounds. AO9 will offer already known sites, while the locations and types of projects is not yet known for AO10, but updates on the process and the sites will come in September. But we do expect that AO10 will start in 2026. Moving a step further north, a market that has been taking some key steps is Ireland. Although only one small operational project, the market has in recent years seen a massive interest from developers. As shown on the map here, each shape is a project application with 73 marked out in total. We see the focus areas are off the east and south coast, with for the most part fixed projects, and with more floating projects off the west and north coast. The Irish government is now also changing tax, opting for more focus on state-selected sites instead of the open door styled method. 4 areas for fixed projects have now been selected, shown as the black shapes on the map, with the first scheduled for allocation by the start of next year. As we also see here, there's a lot of projects already in the works from developers close to these sites, giving an indication of which developers might partake in the upcoming rounds. Lastly, we zoom out and take a look at the macro view and the pipeline for projects toward 2030. Based on the announced CODs from developers, operational offshore wind capacity could reach around 216 gigawatts in 2030. While the current forecast for operational capacity at the end of this year is 43.2 gigawatts. Towards 2030, this would equal to an annual growth rate of around 23%. But as we know, both developers and governments can be somewhat overambitious when it comes to CODs, or the permitting, maturing, and development process can be slower than expected, and the real number for operational capacity in 2030 is expected to be lower. These numbers are excluding the Chinese markets, and if you're interested in more details on future Chinese projects, please don't hesitate to reach out after the webinar. And currently, there are lease areas identified with the potential of up to 261 gigawatts. A number of these will not see projects operational before 2030, and activity until then will be dominated for the most part by familiar markets like Northern Europe, US East Coast, Taiwan, and Japan. Some exceptions though. A number of new markets have already opened or might soon open new lease areas for applications. These include ongoing rounds in Colombia and India, hopefully rounds soon in Portugal and Spain, in addition to promising signals from markets such as Greece and Brazil a bit down the line. The chart here shows the expected capacities to be awarded per year based on announced rounds and timelines. We see a decline in the amounts of scheduled capacities due to most countries not announcing plans for rounds beyond a 4 to 5 year horizon. Also to note, the amount of capacity scheduled for this year and next year, showing there's a lot of activity and a lot of opportunities out there. Additional capacities are expected in several new markets toward 2030, although the timelines for these rounds is yet uncertain. So we do expect the capacities for future rounds to go up in the coming years as we get more visibility. There are, of course, some issues, though, that continues to pose a threat to the speed of development. It is slow permitting, supply chain issues, and cost uncertainties are all known and familiar topics. We are also seeing a lower than expected rate of awarded contracts for projects that we expect to be finished within 2 to 3 years, giving a further indication of slow maturing process for these projects, and therefore also a likely lower growth rate of capacity towards 2030. And by that, I give the word back to Oliver and Ryan.
Okay, thank you, Casper. I think it's worth highlighting time is short on these calls. We keep it as brief as we can, so we're not stealing as much time from our audience as we need to. But we've only managed to run around 6 countries in that time. Hopefully that gives you a flavour of some of the key trends that we're seeing in the leasing process as part of the market. Volumes are clearly out there. And our view is it's a very competitive process between different countries at the moment. So lots of volumes available at the moment. But as Casper mentioned at the end, we can't avoid the potential issues around execution. So with that, let me hand things back to you, Ryan, see if we've got any questions that have come in.
Excellent. First of all, thank you to Casper and Oliver on very thorough details here on the awards and opportunities within the offshore wind market. Much appreciated. As Oliver just alluded, if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A section at the top. But while we're waiting for questions to come through, I have a few items I'd like to touch on. First, for our clients that are on the call today, if you would like a deeper discussion on a country that we spoke about today, or if you would like a discussion on a country of your choice, we're more than happy to have those detailed discussions with our clients. Secondly, in June, we will be in Manchester for the Global Offshore Wind Conference. We would love to say hi to anyone that's on the call today. So if you are going to be there, please reach out to me. We'd love to coordinate a time to say hi and dive into details about offshore wind. Again, we have the QR codes here for our mailing list and LinkedIn. Please register if you haven't. You'll be kept up to date on all news and future events. And then if anyone would like a no strings attached demonstration of our database, I'm more than happy to go through that with you. So again, please reach out to me directly. But let's see if there's any questions that have come through. We do have one. And Oliver and Casper, if you go to the Q&A section, you can see it as well, but let me read this off. To which extent do you think vessel limitations will play a role in project awards in today's discussed markets?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, I guess, in respect of the execution. Once the awards have been granted, companies then have the small problem of actually delivering and building out this capacity. So I don't think it's necessarily going to have a role. The governments will not be too concerned on this at the moment. I think they're quite happy to carry on their processes. They're building in some local content into some of those in different jurisdictions, the different local content requirements. But actually, in terms of specific vessel limitations, I would separate it out from those contract awards to a certain extent.
Excellent. Thanks, Oliver. I've actually got a question myself. Probably for you, Oliver, as it relates to the US. How do you see the upcoming November US elections impacting offshore wind, if at all?
Yeah, I had that as one of the bullets, I think, and I didn't cover it in when I was talking. I skipped over it. Yeah, but the political risk was one of the things that we identified in January in our top 10 things to watch. And I think that still stands. And at that point, we were sort of listing can't remember how many countries it was, but a huge number of countries that have offshore wind or will have offshore wind that have elections this year. Clearly, there's some sense of risk around who wins that and what that means for offshore wind, and then what that means for the leasing processes, whether it slows down or not. So I think you're going to be in a better position if you manage to get that lease process underway this year. But BOEM's been pretty forthcoming in setting out their long-term timetable, regardless of politically who's in power. Whether that stands after the elections remains to be seen. So clearly there's some degree of risk on executing on those lease processes in the US.
Excellent, excellent. And just a follow-up question to that, that could be either for Casper or Oliver. Are there any other countries where we see political uncertainty? Either one of you can take this.
Yeah, I guess a good example could be both Spain and Portugal. They had both elections recently, and especially for Portugal, it has postponed a bit the process of putting out a lease round. But we do expect them that they are trying to move forward with that process again and could host rounds this year, towards the end of this year. Yeah.
I think just one thing to highlight on that, beyond sort of talking about the political problems, I think generally we see that lease rounds have a tendency to be delayed and to be slower than we're told they're going to be. So, and that refers back to the comment I made around things slipping on our timelines. So political events can be one of the main triggers on that. By no means the only one, but certainly it's something that we're looking at a lot. And given the number of elections this year, as Casper mentioned, Spain and Portugal clearly gives us some examples recently of where that's caused problems.
Excellent. No, thanks to both of you guys. With that being said, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. We did spend a little bit more time than we usually do, but hopefully everyone found this to be beneficial, and we hope to see everyone next month on the next webinar. Thanks again for today, and we'll talk to everyone soon.